The winter of 1943 pressed cold and unforgiving across the North African desert as dawn crept over the horizon in pale, hesitant light in a makeshift holding area near Bizerte, Tunisia. A German Obergefreiter named Klaus Reinhardt sat with his back against a canvas tent, his uniform caked in dust and dried sweat, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. He had surrendered 3 days prior, after his unit was encircled by American forces during the final collapse of the Afrika Korps. Around him, dozens of other prisoners sat in similar postures, men who had believed themselves invincible under Rommel's command, now reduced to waiting in silence for transport across an ocean they had never expected to see. The air smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and something unfamiliar that drifted from the American mess tents beyond the wire. It was the scent of baking bread. Reinhardt had not eaten real bread in 4 months. The German rations in North Africa had deteriorated steadily since the previous autumn-hard biscuits had crumbled into dust. Ersatz bread made from sawdust and potato starch. Sometimes nothing but dried peas and canned meat that tasted of rust. The propaganda they had consumed for years told them Germany was winning, that the Reich was self-sufficient, that German ingenuity would triumph over material shortages. Yet here he sat, captured and hungry, while the smell of fresh bread rolled across the compound like a memory from another life. He closed his eyes and remembered his mother's kitchen in Bavaria, the warmth of the oven on Christmas morning, the weight of a proper loaf in his hands. That was before the war. That was before everything changed. When the American guards finally brought food that afternoon, Reinhardt expected little. He had heard stories from older soldiers about the Great War, about meager rations in Allied prison camps, about hunger and disease. The Geneva Convention was a distant formality in the chaos of global conflict. But when the mess tin was placed in his hands, he stared at its contents in confusion. A thick slice of white bread, soft and pillowy, sat beside a portion of stew with visible chunks of meat and vegetables. There was butter, real butter, not the gray margarine they had choked down in the desert. There was coffee, dark and steaming. There was more food in this single meal than he had seen in a week on the front lines. He lifted the bread to his nose and inhaled. It smelled like home. It smelled impossible. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the industrial heartland of America, factories churned without ceasing. The United States had transformed itself into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, a productive colossus unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. In 1943 alone, American farms produced over 20 million tons of wheat, enough to feed not only the entire U.S. military, but also millions of Allied soldiers and civilians across Europe and Asia. The bread Klaus Reinhardt held in his hands was not a luxury, it was standard issue, mass-produced in quantities that defied German comprehension. While Nazi Germany struggled to feed its own population through rationing, confiscation, and forced labor, American bakeries operated around the clock, supplying military depots with fresh bread daily. This was not merely a difference in logistics. It was a difference in civilizations. The German soldiers who became prisoners of war between 1943 and 1945 numbered over 370,000. The vast majority captured in the final 18 months of the conflict as the Wehrmacht collapsed on multiple fronts. They were transported to camps across the continental United States to Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Wisconsin, even remote corners of Montana and Arizona. The journey itself was disorienting. Many had never seen a body of water larger than the Rhine, yet they crossed the Atlantic in Liberty ships, packed into holds that still smelled of the tanks and trucks they had carried on the outbound voyage. They expected privation. They expected punishment. They expected the kind of brutal treatment the SS had meted out to Soviet prisoners in the East. Instead, they found something that shattered the foundational myths. They had been raised to believe. The camps themselves defied expectation. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, prisoners were housed in wooden barracks with heating, running water, and electric lighting. They received 3 meals a day, calculated to provide 2,800 calories more than the average German civilian received under rationing in 1944. They had access to medical care, recreational facilities, and educational programs. They could write letters home, though censored. They could play sports, form orchestras, stage theatrical productions. The contrast with what they had been told about American decadence and weakness was so profound that many assumed it was temporary, a facade that would crumble once the novelty of their capture wore off. But the bread kept coming. Every single day, the bread kept coming down at Camp Alva in Oklahoma. A former lieutenant named Friedrich Weber kept a secret diary, writing in the margins of a book he had been allowed to keep. His entries from the spring of 1944 reveal the psychological rupture that American abundance created in the German mind. "They feed us better than we fed ourselves in garrison," he wrote. "The bread is white and soft, nothing like the dense black loaves we knew in Germany. They waste nothing, yet they have everything. How can a democracy, which our Führer said was weak and disorganized, produce such plenty? How can a nation of individualists defeat a nation of disciplined soldiers?" These questions haunted him. They haunted thousands of prisoners who faced the same cognitive dissonance daily. The bread became a symbol, though few articulated it so clearly at the time. It was not just sustenance, it was evidence. Evidence that the world they had been taught to believe in was a lie. German propaganda had spent a decade constructing an elaborate mythology that democracies were decadent and inefficient, that racial purity produced strength, that authoritarian discipline was the only path to greatness. Yet here, in the land of supposed chaos and mongrel races, was an industrial and agricultural machine so powerful it could feed millions while simultaneously equipping the largest military force ever assembled. The bread was proof that something fundamental had been misunderstood. Before the war, Germany had been the most scientifically advanced nation in Europe. Its universities led the world in physics, chemistry, and engineering. Its factories produced precision instruments, chemicals, and machinery that set global standards. Yet Nazi ideology had crippled this potential through its obsession with racial purity and autarky, economic self-sufficiency. When Jewish scientists fled in the 1930s, Germany lost Nobel laureates. When the regime prioritized ideological conformity over competence, it lost innovation. When it pursued territorial conquest instead of trade, it lost access to global resources. By 1943, Germany was cannibalizing occupied territories to sustain its war machine, while America's farms and factories expanded production year after year without collapsing under their own weight. The prisoners noticed other things too. The American guards were often informal, even casual, in their interactions. They did not march in rigid lockstep. They joked with each other. They chewed gum and smoked cigarettes with an ease that seemed almost insulting to men trained in Prussian military discipline. Yet these same casual soldiers had crushed the Wehrmacht in North Africa, Sicily, and France. They had stormed beaches under withering fire. They had outfought and outproduced an enemy that had been told it was racially superior. The disconnect between Nazi teaching and observable reality became impossible to ignore. Klaus Reinhardt, the Obergefreiter from Bavaria, was eventually transferred to a camp in Nebraska. He worked on a farm during the harvest season of 1944, part of a labor program that helped address American agricultural manpower shortages, while giving prisoners something productive to do. The farmer who supervised him, a man named Henry Schultz, whose own grandparents had emigrated from Germany, treated him with neither cruelty nor particular kindness, simply as a worker. At lunch, Schultz's wife brought sandwiches to the field, thick slices of ham and cheese on white bread, with mustard and pickles. She poured lemonade from a glass pitcher. Reinhardt ate slowly, savoring every bite, and watched the American farmers' children play in the yard of a house that had a radio, a telephone, and a car parked outside. This was not wealth. This was normalcy. And that, perhaps, was the most devastating revelation of all. The German soldiers had been told that America was a land of exploitation, where workers starved while capitalists grew fat. They had been shown propaganda films of breadlines during the Depression, of strikes and labor violence, of racial segregation and urban poverty. All of this was true. America was far from perfect, and its contradictions were profound. But what the propaganda had not shown, what the prisoners now witnessed firsthand, was the sheer productive capacity of a system built on voluntary exchange, innovation, and resource abundance. Even in wartime, even with rationing, the average American family ate better than the average German family had eaten in peacetime. The prisoners could see it, taste it, and could no longer deny it. Some prisoners resisted the implications. Hardcore Nazi believers clung to the ideology, insisting that the abundance was temporary, that Germany would still win through superior will and racial destiny. They formed cliques within the camps, enforcing loyalty through intimidation. There were even incidents of violence. Prisoners suspected of becoming too friendly with their captors were beaten, and in a few cases, killed by their fellow POWs. The SS and Ardent Party members maintained a shadow hierarchy within the wire, trying to preserve the world they had known, even as the evidence of its falsity piled up around them like the uneaten portions of American meals that guards scraped into waste bins, food that would have been treasured in a German trench, discarded as surplus in an American camp. But for many others, the bread became the beginning of doubt. Friedrich Weber, the lieutenant in Oklahoma, wrote in his diary about conversations with other officers late at night in the barracks. "We talk in whispers about what we have seen," he noted. "No one wants to be the first to say it aloud, but we all think we were lied to. Not about everything, perhaps, but about the essential things. About who was strong and who was weak. About what kind of society could sustain a great nation. The Americans are not supermen. They are often foolish and careless. But their system works in a way ours did not, and we are paying the price for that failure." The bread kept coming through 1944 and into 1945, as Germany collapsed, as Berlin burned and the Reich disintegrated. The prisoners in America continued to receive their 3 meals a day. They listened to radio broadcasts, uncensored news from the front lines, reports of concentration camps being liberated, evidence of atrocities committed in their nation's name. Some refused to believe. Some wept. Some fell into silence and did not speak for days. The psychological weight of realizing that you have fought for a regime of murderers, that your sacrifices meant nothing, that your beliefs were built on lies. This weight was heavier than any physical hardship. And through it all, the bread kept coming, a daily reminder that the world was not what they had been told. The symbolism was inescapable. Bread is the most fundamental food, the staff of life, the substance that has sustained civilizations since the dawn of agriculture. In German, the word Brot carries connotations of home, sustenance, and survival. "Gib uns unser täglich Brot," give us this day our daily bread, the Lord's Prayer intones. Yet Germany, under the Nazis, had failed to provide even this most basic necessity to its soldiers in the field. The regime that promised greatness had delivered hunger. The democracy that was supposed to be weak and chaotic had delivered abundance. The cognitive dissonance was not subtle. It was served on a tin plate, day after day. Impossible to ignore. American abundance was not accidental. It was the product of a system that, for all its flaws, had certain structural advantages that authoritarian regimes could not replicate. The United States had vast natural resources, farmland, minerals, oil, timber spread across a continent protected by two oceans. It had a population that, while diverse and often fractious, was united by a common language and a shared, if imperfectly realized, commitment to democratic governance. It had a market economy that, while prone to booms and busts, incentivized innovation and efficiency in ways that centralized planning could not match. And perhaps most importantly, it had avoided the kind of ideological rigidity that crippled Nazi decision-making at every level. German economic policy under the Nazis was driven by autarky, the belief that Germany must be self-sufficient to avoid the vulnerabilities that had contributed to its defeat in World War I. This led to massive inefficiencies, synthetic rubber and fuel, programs that consumed enormous resources, agricultural policies that prioritized ideology over productivity, industrial strategies that emphasized rearmament over civilian needs. By contrast, American economic mobilization for World War II was pragmatic and flexible. The government coordinated production, but did not micromanage it. Private companies competed for contracts, driving innovation. Labor unions negotiated for higher wages, which increased consumer demand and sustained morale. The system was messy and imperfect, but it worked. The prisoners saw the results of this system, not just in the bread, but in everything around them. The trucks that transported them were mass-produced Chevrolets and Fords, identical and interchangeable, rolling off assembly lines by the hundreds of thousands. The guards wore uniforms that were standardized but comfortable, made from durable fabrics and sizes that actually fit. The camp facilities, while Spartan, were functional and maintained. There was no shortage of soap, no shortage of fuel, no shortage of replacement parts. Everything worked because the system that produced it was designed to work, not to serve an ideological vision, but to solve practical problems efficiently. This was the ultimate indictment of Nazi ideology. The regime had promised to create a new order, a 1,000-year Reich built on the superiority of the German race and the efficiency of authoritarian governance. Instead, it had produced a catastrophic war, industrial-scale genocide, and material privation for its own people. Meanwhile, the decadent democracy it had sought to destroy had outproduced, outfought, and outlasted it. The bread was not just food. It was evidence of systemic failure at the highest level. Not all prisoners drew political conclusions from their experiences. Many simply wanted to survive, to return home, to forget the war and rebuild their lives. But for those who thought deeply about what they had witnessed, the bread became a starting point for a broader reckoning. Friedrich Weber, after his return to Germany in 1946, became a teacher. He never joined a political party again. He spoke rarely of his time as a prisoner, but when he did, he always mentioned the bread. "It was the small things that undid us," he would say. "We thought we were strong because we could march in formation and follow orders without question. But strength is not discipline. It is the ability to feed your people, to innovate, to adapt." The Americans understood that. We did not. Klaus Reinhardt returned to Bavaria and took over his family's bakery. He had learned American baking techniques during his time in the camp, where he had worked in the kitchen for the final year of his captivity. He introduced white bread to his shop, alongside the traditional dark rye loaves. His customers were skeptical at first. White bread seemed foreign, too soft, almost frivolous. But it sold. It reminded people, perhaps, of a world beyond scarcity, beyond war. Reinhardt never spoke much about why he made the change. But those who knew him saw the distant look in his eyes when he pulled a fresh loaf from the oven. And they understood that he was remembering something he could not quite articulate. The psychological impact of captivity on German POWs in America has been studied extensively by historians. Many prisoners underwent what scholars call re-education, formal programs designed to introduce them to democratic principles and to counter Nazi indoctrination. These programs had mixed success. Some prisoners were receptive, others hostile. But the informal education, the daily experience of living in a functioning democracy, even as prisoners, may have been more effective than any classroom lecture. The prisoners saw that Americans argued with each other, criticized their own government, and still managed to win the war. They saw that a society of individuals, each pursuing their own interests, could coordinate action on a scale that dwarfed anything the collectivist Reich had achieved. This lesson was not lost on everyone. After the war, as West Germany rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, a new generation of German leaders, many of whom had experienced the war, firsthand made a conscious choice to embrace democratic governance and market economics. The contrast with East Germany, which fell under Soviet control and adopted authoritarian central planning, was stark. West Germany became an economic powerhouse. The Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, of the 1950s and 60s. East Germany stagnated behind the Iron Curtain, its people increasingly desperate to escape. The bread that German POWs it in American camps was a preview of the future their nation could choose or reject. The symbolism of bread extends beyond economics and politics into the realm of culture and identity. In many ways, the white bread of mid-20th century America represented a particular vision of modernity, standardized, mass-produced, efficient, and accessible. It was not the artisanal loaf of a European bakery, crafted by a master baker using techniques passed down through generations. It was industrial bread, made in factories, wrapped in wax paper, sold in grocery stores. To European sensibilities, it seemed almost absurdly bland, lacking the depth and character of traditional breads. Yet this very blandness was part of its power. It was egalitarian bread, democratic bread, the same loaf on every table, from the richest suburb to the poorest farm. German prisoners, raised in a culture that prized tradition and craftsmanship, found themselves confronting a different set of values. American culture celebrated innovation and practicality over tradition. It valued quantity and accessibility over exclusivity. It was optimistic, forward-looking, and unapologetically commercial. This was jarring to men who had been taught that culture meant high art, classical music, and philosophical depth, who believed that Germany's cultural superiority justified its political ambitions. Yet here they were, defeated and captive, eating bread produced by a culture they had been taught to despise. And the bread was good. It was nourishing. It was abundant. How could this be? The answer lay in the fundamental difference between a society organized around collective myth and one organized around individual opportunity. Nazi Germany had constructed an elaborate mythology of blood and soil, of racial destiny and historical greatness. It had mobilized its population through appeals to collective identity and existential struggle. But myths, no matter how powerful, cannot replace material reality. You cannot eat ideology. You cannot build a tank with willpower alone. The practical, unglamorous work of farming, manufacturing, and logistics, the things that actually sustain a nation at war, require systems that reward competence and efficiency. Not ideological purity. America had those systems. They were far from perfect. They were marred by racism, inequality, and exploitation. But they worked well enough to produce the material abundance that won the war. And that abundance, symbolized by something as simple as a slice of white bread, became the most effective propaganda imaginable. It required no speeches, no posters, no rallies. It simply existed, undeniable and daily, in the hands of men who had been told it was impossible. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the prisoners in American camps had experienced something unprecedented. They had lived through their nation's total defeat, not in misery, but in relative comfort. They had been fed, clothed, and housed better than many had been in their own army. They had seen a functioning civil society up close, with all its contradictions and complexities. They had been given time to think, to read, to question. And many of them had concluded that the world they had fought for was a lie. The return home was difficult. Germany in 1945 and 1946 was a landscape of ruins, physical and moral. Cities were rubble. Millions were dead or missing. The Nazi regime had not only lost the war, but had committed crimes so monstrous that the German people would bear the collective shame for generations. The prisoners returning from America brought with them stories of abundance and normalcy that seemed almost obscene in the context of such devastation. How could they speak of white bread when people in Berlin were starving? How could they describe comfortable barracks when families were living in cellars? Yet those stories mattered. They represented a possibility, a vision of what Germany could become if it made different choices. The prisoners who returned from America were witnesses to an alternative modernity, one that did not require authoritarianism or racial ideology. They had seen that democracy, for all its mésalliances, could work. They had seen that a diverse society could be strong. They had seen that abundance was possible without conquest. These lessons would shape the reconstruction of West Germany in ways both obvious and subtle. The bread itself, as a physical object, was soon forgotten. Prisoners returning to Germany had more pressing concerns than the quality of American baking. But the memory lingered, the cognitive shock of that first meal, the daily ritual of meals that never failed to arrive, the dawning realization that everything they had been taught was wrong. For men like Klaus Reinhardt and Friedrich Weber, the bread became a touchstone, a moment when the world revealed itself to be different than they had believed. It was not a moment of drama or violence, but a quiet undermining of certainty, as gentle and relentless as the rising of bread dough in a warm kitchen dock in the decades after the war. As historians interviewed aging veterans and examined declassified documents, the story of German POWs in America became a footnote to the larger narrative of World War II. It lacked the drama of combat or the horror of the concentration camps. It was simply a logistical exercise, the management of hundreds of thousands of captured enemy soldiers, according to the Geneva Conventions. Yet within that mundane framework was a profound human story, the story of men confronting the collapse of their worldview, not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small, undeniable truths. The bread was one of those truths. It was not the most important truth that honor belonged to the documentation of Nazi atrocities, the evidence of systematic genocide that no amount of denial could erase. But it was a truth that operated on a different level, visceral and immediate. It said, your leaders told you that this enemy was weak, degenerate, and incapable. Yet this enemy has fed you better than your own government ever did. What else were they wrong about? This question, once asked, could not be unasked. It spread through the prison camps in whispers and glances, in the silences between men who had once believed they were destined for greatness. It followed them home to Germany, where the ruins of the Reich made the question even more urgent. It shaped the choices they made in the decades that followed, as they rebuilt their lives in a country that had to reckon with both its past and its future. The bread was never just bread. It was a symbol of systemic difference, a daily reminder that the world was not organized the way Nazi ideology claimed. It was evidence that a democracy could outproduce an autocracy, that diversity could be a strength rather than a weakness, that freedom and abundance were not contradictions but complements. These were lessons that some prisoners rejected, clinging to their old beliefs until death. But for others, the bread was the beginning of wisdom, the recognition that strength is not found in rigid discipline or racial mythology, but in the ability to adapt, innovate, and provide for one's people. In the end, the most devastating critique of Nazi Germany came not from Allied propaganda, but from observable reality. The regime that promised to lead Germany to glory instead led it to ruin. The ideology that claimed to understand the laws of history and race was exposed as a murderous fantasy. And the enemy that was supposed to be weak and decadent proved to be stronger in all the ways that mattered. The bread that German prisoners ate in American camps was a small part of this reality, but it was a part that they could touch, taste, and remember. It was proof, served daily, that they had been betrayed by their own leaders, years later. In the 1960s and 70s, as Germany had become one of the world's leading economies and a stable democracy, historians began to interview the aging survivors of the war. Many former POWs spoke of their time in America with a strange mixture of shame and gratitude. They were ashamed to have been captured, to have failed in their duty as soldiers. But they were grateful for the treatment they received and for the perspective it gave them. One former prisoner, interviewed in 1978, summed it up simply: "I learned more about the world in that camp than I learned in 12 years of Nazi education. I learned that what we were told was strong was actually weak, and what we were told was weak was actually strong. I learned it from the food, from the way the guards talked to us, from the simple fact that we were treated like human beings. That was the real defeat, not the battles we lost, but the realization that we had been wrong about everything." The bread, in this sense, was a teacher. It taught without words, through the simple fact of its existence. It taught that ideologies must be measured against material reality, that propaganda cannot substitute for productivity, that a nation's strength is not found in its ability to march in formation, but in its ability to feed its people. These are simple lessons, almost banal in their obviousness. Yet they were lessons that an entire generation of Germans had to learn the hard way, through defeat and captivity and the slow, painful process of rebuilding their understanding of the world. Today, the story of German POWs in America is largely forgotten outside academic circles. The camps have been torn down, the prisoners have died, and the world has moved on. But the lesson endures. It is a lesson about the power of systems over ideology, of material reality over myth, of daily experience over grand narratives. It is a lesson that speaks to every generation that must choose between the seductive certainty of authoritarianism and the messy, frustrating, but ultimately more effective path of democratic governance. The bread that stunned German prisoners was not miraculous. It was the product of hard work, good soil, advanced agricultural science, efficient transportation networks, and a political system that, for all its flaws, created conditions for prosperity. It was the result of millions of individual decisions made by farmers, bakers, truckers, and bureaucrats, all coordinating through the mechanisms of market and democracy. It was ordinary, mass-produced, and abundant. And precisely because it was all these things, it was revolutionary. In the quiet moments, in the barracks at night, in the fields during harvest, in the mess halls during meals, German prisoners confronted this revolution. They held it in their hands. They tasted it. They could not deny it. And for many of them, that simple act, eating a slice of American bread, was the moment when the world they had known began to crumble, replaced slowly and painfully by something closer to truth. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no speeches or revelations, just bread, day after day, and the growing realization that everything had changed. The bread was testimony. It spoke of abundance in a world of scarcity, of generosity in a time of war, of the strength of a system that did not rely on myth or terror to function. It was proof that the future belonged not to the rigid hierarchies of fascism, but to the open, chaotic, productive mess of democratic capitalism. The prisoners who ate that bread were witnesses to this truth, whether they wanted to be or not. And in the years that followed, as Germany rebuilt itself on democratic principles and market economics, that truth became the foundation of a new and better nation. The bread that stunned German prisoners was not just food. It was a prophecy fulfilled, a demonstration that the arc of history, for all its twists and turns, bends toward systems that serve human needs rather than ideological fantasies. It was a reminder, served on a tin plate in a prison camp, that strength is found not in the ability to dominate, but in the ability to produce, not in the power to destroy, but in the capacity to sustain. These are lessons written not in grand declarations, but in the small, daily realities that shape human life. They are lessons as simple, as nourishing, and as enduring as bread.